morning, and thank you for joining us for this personalized medicine panel. I have a great pleasure of hosting this panel today. My name is Shantanu Mittal. I'm a business development manager with the Ontario Centers of Excellence. And we put together this panel on personalized medicine mainly because we believe that this is the future of medicine. At OCE, we're starting to see a lot of innovations coming through in the area of personalized medicine. And we're also starting to see a growing cluster of entrepreneurs and researchers in this space. So today, we thought we'll put together an expert panel who can talk about what personalized medicine is, what the key trends and technologies are in this space, the challenges to starting up a business using personalized medicine technology, and also some of the most relevant business models in this space. Our moderator today is Dr. Alison Symington.
That's right.
Thank you. She's the Vice President and Vice President of Corporate Development and Communications at the Ontario Genomics Institute. And Alison's responsible for OGI's relationship with external stakeholders, corporate communications, and educational outreach programs. Thank you, Alison, for joining us today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Shantanu. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. If you're sitting at the back, you might find it a little noisy. I have in some of the other sessions, so feel free to move back unless you're looking for a quick escape, in which case you can stay at the back. So today's panel is on personalized medicine, being a big discussion about whether it should even be called personalized medicine, as if this is something new that's never been done before. Every time you get a family history done, in fact, that's personal medicine. So I think we need to put it in context of that kind of thing. And so some of the other terms that are being thrown around are things like precision medicine, being able to more precisely define what course of action should be taken. And it's already here, right? So drugs like Herceptin are examples of personalized medicine. So it's not like Ontario hasn't seen the beginning of this, but it's just the very beginning. So there's some incredible opportunities, and there's also huge amounts of challenges. Challenges in big data, challenges in regulation, challenges in commercialization pathways, and I think we're going to talk about that today. Of course, it's of huge importance to us globally and obviously in Ontario. As we are a major healthcare player, we have one of the biggest HMOs, if you want to think of OHIP as an HMO, with almost 13 million people in it. So I think it's an important thing for us to talk about. And so before we start talking about that gives a little bit of context. I'm going to briefly introduce the whole panel, and then I'm going to give them some questions to start some overview conversation, so we can start the conversation, and then we really are looking for audience participation and audience interaction to maintain the conversation going. So I'd first like to introduce Christopher Trevors. Christopher's the Canadian General Manager of Centogene AG, which is a German molecular diagnostics company. And during his clinical career, Christopher has worked at Westchester Medical Center in Hawthorne, New York. And then he spent 9 years at the Hospital for Sick Children, where he worked his way from a genetic counselor to a clinical educator and evaluator in the areas of genetics, ethics, and molecular and genomics technologies. So can speak to a wide breadth of issues around those kinds of things. And as I said, Christopher is currently working for Centogene. So thank you for joining us. Next to Christopher is Carolyn Popper. She's the co-founder and president of Popper & Company. She has more than 21 years of experience, though you wouldn't know to look at her, with hands-on biotech and medical device. She's able to draw on her medical and scientific perspectives with knowledge gained from managing a wide spectrum of life science businesses in diagnostics and digital health in both Fortune 500 and startup companies. Carolyn came to us, flew up from Florida yesterday, so welcome, Carolyn. Our next panelist, sitting next to Carolyn, is Levin. He's the Vice President of Evidence Development and Standards for Health Quality Ontario. He's also the founding CSO of the Mars Excite program, which I'm sure we might chat about today, which provides pre-market evidence-based assessment of new health technologies as a collaboration between industry, academia, and government, and the broader health system. So thank you very much, Les, for joining us. And last but not least is Dr. Ken Pritzker, President and CEO of RNA Diagnostics, which is currently developing an RNA disruption assay, which is a personalized medicine molecular test to determine whether or not breast cancer chemotherapy is working effectively in individual patients. He served as a chief of pathology at the laboratory medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital, and subsequently he was the founder of the Mount Sinai Services, a laboratory service outreach vehicle for biomedical research and innovation. So welcome, Dr. Pritzker, and thank you all for coming today. The plan is, as I said, I'm going to ask a few questions, we'll get started, and then I'll throw it out to the audience. So I'm going to start with Carolyn, actually. If I can find my thing. So Carolyn, maybe you could give us a bit of an overview of some of the new innovations you see in personalized medicine, both in the oncology, which probably is further along than everything else, and some of the other areas that they're being used in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Alison, and I'm really happy you started off kind of moving us slightly beyond the name of personalized medicine, because I think that was helpful in its time, and now maybe a little misleading. I always used to like to qualify it by putting the word more in front of it, so it's more personalized. Really, for the non-clinical marketing people in the room, I see it as just old-fashioned segmentation. So trying to take the big population of patients with a disease definition at the 60,000-foot level, to drop that down a bit and put those patients into segments that more accurately describe the nature of the pathology that they have and the relationship between that pathology and the rest of their body. For that reason, I prefer the term precision, and if you do a Google search, you can really see a big uptake in the adoption of the term precision, and I suspect in the next year or so we'll be seeing more and more of that. The other trend that I thought I would highlight at the beginning today is the trend whereby clinicians, as well as people delivering therapeutics, are looking at diagnostics and devices beyond just biomarkers. So I think biomarkers are obviously enormously important in this more personalized, more precise medicine. But I think we're seeing an increased interplay of biomarkers and devices that together are enabling a more precise delivery of healthcare. So what do I mean by that? I think that we're seeing tools that combine information derived from an analysis of biomarkers with other parameters, including physiological parameters in monitoring devices, bringing those together to create packages of information that help guide therapy. So from my perspective, and increasingly in talking to pharma companies, as we do at our firm, we're seeing their interest in precision medicine involving diagnostics and devices, and really being enabled by digital tools or digitized results, imaging, biomarker analysis, physiological parameters, et cetera, coming together to allow more personalized medicine. The other obstacle that has always existed, and that I think are starting to make progress on by virtue of the broader availability of information to patients or to consumers through the internet, is the whole concept of probability and risk. Because in personalized medicine, there are no absolutes. It's an enormous challenge both for healthcare providers, but even more so for patients, to really come to terms with what does relative risk mean? What does probability mean? But I think with a lot of innovation in the way messages are delivered, and I think you, from your counseling background, may have many thoughts on that. I think we're being able to combine an understanding of what risk and probability means, along with biomarkers and other parameters, to push forward the frontiers of more precise medicine.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Could you also speak a little bit maybe about, on a global perspective, some of the different business models people have been looking at to commercialize these kind of things? You mentioned you've been working with Big Pharma, but just in general.
So, yeah, when you mentioned that question, I sort of scratched my head because it's, at least in my view, a yet to be resolved question. And I think the way to look at it is as follows. You see diagnostic development with its own risks, its own likelihood of success, and its own reimbursement models on the one hand. And you see drug development on the other with a completely different set of parameters. And so over the last 5 to 7 years, at least from my US perspective, there have been a lot of attempts to do those two things in parallel and to bring them together at certain points. So start off doing it in parallel and get approval so that you have a test when the drug is available. And I think there are very few examples of that working because the two processes are completely different. It's also very difficult to get a diagnostic company to take the risk of development when the drug has an enormous risk of failure. So in terms of business models, I see diagnostic companies, if we just focus on biomarkers, developing deep expertise in a platform technology that can be used for many applications, including potentially with a given drug, but having its own business viability assured by virtue of the platform, and then interacting with the pharma company and the drug at various points along the way, but where the diagnostic platform has a reason for existence, such as in RNA, established indication, novel diagnostic, works perfectly. But to start off out of the gate, trying to develop these things in parallel, I have yet to see a business model that really works. So I guess my bottom line, when you raise that question, is that an old boss of mine, used to say this all the time: every tub needs to stand on its own bottom. So the diagnostic approach, be it a biomarker or a device, a diagnostic platform, or whatever, has to be commercially viable. And then the interaction with the therapy or the management is kind of a kicker or a bonus on top of that.
Thanks, Karen. I think that's a great lead in now to talk to Christopher and then Ken about, from your experience with your company, what kind of opportunities exist for companies looking to commercialize in precision or personalized medicine, getting them into the hospitals or clinics, and what are the barriers? And clearly that could spend all hours, so in a small amount of time.
So I'll first kind of relate back to the biomarkers that Caroline talked about, and it's our company actually looks at biomarkers in the reverse. So we've identified companies that have drugs that are widely used in the market, that have large profit margins for these pharma companies, and our company has actually gone back and discovered biomarkers that we've then licensed to those companies that help them prove that their drugs have a greater efficacy potentially than their competitors, and also can be used with ongoing dosing of drugs. Excuse me. And that's been very successful for us. And we actually, through those programs, have helped broaden the number of patients diagnosed with those conditions. So in fact, increase their sales as well. And that has made up, in a very short period of time, probably now, it accounts for about 30% of our business. So it's not insignificant. And I think in Canada, talking about Canada first, I think there are a lot of opportunities here that are ignored by a lot of American companies. And our experience being a German company coming into Canada, and the reason we moved here is actually Canada makes up about 25% of our market. And we have a great expertise here, but for some reason Canadians like to ship their diagnostics abroad, and that is changing. But it's the American companies, because of the size of their own market, often ignore the Canadian market. And so there are a lot of opportunities for Canadians here that are innovative and willing to go out and market within the Canadian context. And that has been, we've been very successful with that. And we're opening a lab in Toronto in the fall because of that. And I think some of the limitations here, though, in our market is really we're a bit behind in the training of our healthcare providers in the area of genetics. And many of the clinicians would like to order some of these tests associated, that could help their patients significantly, but they don't have enough education in genetics to understand how to order the test, what the test means, and then at the other end, there's a lot of anxiety about when this result comes back of this testing, how do I interpret that in a meaningful way for the patient? So I think we have a lot of work to do, and we're not unique in that aspect. I think a lot of countries have kind of, with the explosion of genomics and genetics and personalized medicine, have a lot of catching up to do. The Canadian market has a great uptake of new technologies, so the clinicians here seem to be more willing than in some other countries that we work in, and we work in about 90 countries, to actually order new testing, use new technologies. But what they really want to know in the end is, what difference will this test make in my patient's life? How will this change the management? And I think there's some of the concern with we have now. There are a lot of great opportunities out there for personalized medicine tests and devices, but the governments, rightfully so, are hesitant to pay for it because there's not a lot of data at the other end that shows the net benefits to patients and also the savings in costs for the system. So.
We'll come back to that point, I'm sure, with Les, but Ken, perhaps you could talk about the commercialization pathway of your company, which is slightly different than the Centogene model, so maybe talk about yours.
Yes, Alison, I'm happy to. So our company identified some very interesting intellectual property, that the RNA in tumors was compromised in patients who were responding to chemotherapy. And the question then became, how could you use this? What is the need? What is the need? And the need to tell folks that their chemotherapy is working is there, but that's a nice to know. The need to tell the patients and their physicians that this particular chemotherapy is not working is imperative to know, because it gives the opportunity to change to more effective therapies. So this was the driving force, is this need, and this need is international and existed long before our company. So essentially, the company was formed to meet a need that we knew to be out there.
And what kind of obstacles have you faced when you've been trying to move this technology through the market?
Well, I would say all kinds, but the key one is time. There isn't enough time to get everything done, and there's a very finite amount of money, insufficient money actually, to accomplish things. And you're working with groups who have all kinds of time, institutions, academics, larger companies. They have the time, we don't. So we have to be able to accomplish things against this set of barriers. I would also say that in Ontario particularly, which we're familiar, the agencies, including OCE, which is one of the first to step up to the plate, and OGI, and HTX and others, have all been very helpful in reducing that barrier, because they've been helping us to access expertise and capital and this kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. So let's going to kind of the more government or regulatory pre-market evaluation space. Do you think there's a disconnect between what the industry feels it needs to move over? Do they understand what the government needs in terms of evidence to go forward with a project?
Yes, it takes time, if you have something new, to develop the awareness and understanding. And that awareness and understanding has to be within not only within the potential clients, but within the potential senior investors and many other groups. And if it's actually truly new, as our technology is, then a great deal of effort must be made to educate and to develop awareness.
Okay. Les, can you comment on that same question about industry and government and what the two bodies need or think they need?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off by making a kind of crazy statement. I haven't been shot down yet for making a statement. Industry and innovation are part of the health system. When you look at it from that perspective, Ontario has one of the largest corporations in Canada. It's called the health system. Annual budget's about $48 billion a year. And you'd say that this corporation has no R&D until you take a step back and you say, well, there's R&D. It's all been done by industry, by academia. That's where the R&D is coming from. But in that case, it's the most dysfunctional corporation in the universe because you have R&D working somewhere down the corridor, and every once in a while they come to the front end of the corporation and say, look what we've got. And the corporation says, afraid not. No, we don't need this, it's irrelevant, it's not disruptive, patients don't, we just don't need this stuff. And even, internationally, that's an international situation. That's a status quo international, wherever you go. But even in the post-market space, we do have consistency in trying to address the whole issue of opportunistic opportunity costs. So we do look at the quality of evidence of effectiveness and safety. We do look at value for money. We do look at societal and ethical considerations, and we do look at feasibility and disruptive potential. So that's how the prioritization of allocation of funding goes in a transparent way, at least in Ontario and other jurisdictions as well. But what happens if you take all of that stuff and you stick it into the pre-market space, and instead of using evidence to police the uptake of technology, when it's too late, you hit that brick wall, you're dead. 48% of what the Ontario Health Technology Advisory Committee looks at, it rejects because there's not enough evidence, the wrong questions are asked in the pre-market space, etc. What a waste of money, what a waste of innovative energy. If you take that and you put it in the pre-market space, you start working with industry, with innovators, with government, with academia, as we have done with Excite through Mars. You start to address the real issue of what is relevant to the health system, disruptive potential, optimizing patient outcomes in an ownership way with government and everyone in that pre-market space all working together to further that innovative agenda. And that's where I think I'd like to land this. And I think that's the way in which we're kind of moving forward on the Excite project. We've been in existence for, I think it's now 14 months. And we are currently in the process of either evaluating with industry and with government, academia. I think there are 8 small, medium enterprises. We're evaluating 8 technologies, and one is a multinational, and the multinationals are now stacking up, hopefully to come to Ontario and to have us do the evaluations increasingly. I think that's on the cards.
Thank you. Chris, you're from a global company, and you talked a little bit about why they might come here, but what's kind of the pathway to go out from here to the rest of the global world?
I think for us it's been basically we've started out with a small group of key market players, networking through conferences such as these, etc., and really trying to utilize the multiculturalism that exists within this country as well to make connections in those individuals' home countries. So it's made it easier for us linguistically, and as well that diversity internationally for us is very important for our growth. All of the technology to analyze a lot of the DNA has become much more inexpensive, will continue to do so. And where the real value is in a company like ours is actually in the data that we create. And you can look at a genetic result from one individual of one ethnic background and have a completely different interpretation of that from someone from another ethnic background. So it's a strong goal of ours to increase the number of samples and collection and growth internationally for us to help us better serve a Canadian market that actually is very multicultural, so that when we interpret the data, we have the best interpretation possible based on what's known at that time. And so through that kind of collection of samples and growth internationally, it then gives us the data and the informatics to be able to expand with more confidence into the market and make better assertions that we will be able to offer the best interpretation for those communities in those countries. And so we've kind of taken a slow approach. So genetics is a medicine of very wealthy countries. So obviously, Western Europe and whatnot. But we're starting to branch out now through partnerships in China, Brazil, India. We have a few partnerships in a few African countries as well. And those, some of it has been ad hoc, but some of it has been strategic in trying to partner with local organizations or local individuals that have the same interests as us, and trying to grow the business in those countries and be first to market. So,
Calvin, can you kind of speak to the global perspective? Are there a lot of are the issues the same globally, really? I mean, we read a lot about how personalized medicine is being incorporated in England, or certainly I do. But you look at England and Europe, and everywhere you look, there's a new personalized medicine conference, a new precision medicine conference. It seems to be the buzzwords, but globally, are the issues, the opportunities and the issues the same from jurisdiction to jurisdiction?
I think the answer would be yes and no. I like to say yes, because I think the drivers are the same: improve the quality of healthcare delivery at a reduced cost, or at least at the same cost, and definitely not at increased cost, overall to the system. So, and I think those drivers, as I alluded to previously, are the availability of new technology, such as your companies have, the global interest on the part of consumers or patients by virtue of information dissemination through the internet and other sources, so better informed patients and healthcare providers. And the third is global resource constraint. So I think some areas were always resource constrained, and other areas are increasingly resource constrained. So speaking about the US right now, the extent to which resource constraint applies is sort of indirectly through what we call higher co-pays. So patients are paying a bigger piece for a bigger piece of their health care, and so they're paying attention. It's sort of as simple as that. So I think those three forces apply universally, but to different degrees. And I'd further agree with you that I think it's possible for small companies to take a global perspective right out of the gate, paying more attention than they might previously to countries like Canada, like Australia, that have very well developed healthcare systems with good post-market follow-up, etc. And those data generated in those markets are useful for entering other markets. With respect to the BRIC countries and the emerging markets, I worked for Becton Dickinson and Company for many, many years. And there was always a strategy there of finding the so-called middle-class population in these developing countries. And I was often a little bit skeptical about that. I think there's an opportunity with new technology and as well as the increased disposable income in some of these countries to really get the technology to penetrate more broadly than just to the top income earners in those countries. So for example, while a prenatal diagnostic of great depth might be available in Canada or in the US, it's possible to use similar technology to look for the major conditions that you want to identify, package it in a more cost-effective way, and efficiently deliver it, for example, into the Chinese or Indian market, and there'll be tremendous uptake there. So I think that having a global strategy from day one is quite appropriate.
Les, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I think, a little bit outspoken on this, but I really think that personalized medicine has been overstated. I'm very fortunate because I practice as a medical oncologist in a large academic cancer center in Toronto. And personalized medicine is part of what we do in our daily lives. I mean, as physicians, to get a test on a genetic mutation and to get a target drug, that's the way we practice. And that's already crept into medical practice. And the way in which you approve these drugs, these targeted drugs, exactly the same way as you approve any other chemotherapy drug. Is it effective? Is it cost effective? It's in. The only question is whether the cost-effective analysis is done based on the drug and the companion diagnostic together, or whether they're discrete, whether they're separate. The more fuss you make about emphasizing and focusing and targeting personalized medicine as something unique, the more you're going to compromise its diffusion in the health system. Just let it roll. If it's good enough, it'll diffuse, it'll be taken up. The one criticism I have is that there's no consistency in who does the companion diagnostic test. Is it industry? Is it government? Should pharma just roll it all up into one cost and let the health system deal with it and look at it from a cost-effective perspective, which is what's happening anyway. But we need an organizational and policy infrastructure for combining the pharmacogenomic component of personalized medicine. And once we got that, it's just business as usual, and it's a new way, a very exciting way of treating people.
Ken, maybe I could ask you to just add to that, because, Les has talked about the Excite and how it's this industry, this pre-market, everybody works together. And actually, interestingly, in the agri-food this morning, the comment they made in agri-food this morning was effective innovation demands collaboration, which I thought was a really good way of speaking about it. But can you talk from your perspective about industry, government, innovation, and maybe just innovation in the way we work together in this space?
Sure, happy to. So first of all, related to lab medicine in particular, lab medicine is an orphan because it's always been looked at as a cost center rather than a benefit center. My career has been making it into a benefit center. So I'm very familiar with this. And Les is absolutely correct that the diagnostic capability and the therapeutic capability have to be working together. From an industry perspective and from a government perspective, it's not sufficient to have a great therapeutic because it won't work on everybody. So you have to know on which people it will work and will work best. And then you have to be able to know that it is responding, that the patients are responding to that therapeutic. All that relates to the diagnostics. So the diagnostics are about 5% of the equation between diagnostics and therapeutics, but they govern the 95%. So it's rather important to pay attention to that. I'm glad that Les and groups in Ontario are beginning to understand this. It's great. But we have to figure out ways in which the diagnostics and the therapeutics should be evaluated together. And we're just starting along that path.
Thank you. I think we obviously have some time for questions from the audience. We sounds like we can have some good disagreements or collaborations here. So if you want to come up and ask your questions, please identify who you are as you ask your questions. Oh, I see one coming, I think. Hi.
Hi, my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a BD manager with OCE. First, I think this is a great panel. Thanks to all of you for participating. I think by default, most of the discussion has been focused on precision medicine techniques and technologies delivered in a clinical setting. I wondered if you have some thoughts or perspective on the opportunity for direct-to-consumer testing and the barriers and the opportunities that might go along with that. Thanks.
So the question was around direct-to-consumer testing. So who would like to take that question first?
Well, I'll jump into the fire.
Carolyn and then Ken.
So at the risk of being controversial, I'm a big supporter of direct-to-consumer pretty much everything with safeguards. Now, I know it's more heretical in some geographies than in others, but at the end of the day, I've sort of, having started life as a healthcare provider, I've sort of moved to a place where I think that empowered with the right information and with the right guidance from people with the appropriate training, consumers can process information and can be very helpful in determining what's right for them and in controlling cost. That doesn't mean a sort of wanton sort of frenzy of DTC everything, but I think that there's a lot to be said for patient engagement, first and foremost, in the diagnostic process. And also, so I would sort of modify, so where I think the era that we're entering might not be wholesale DTC a la 23andMe, but will be a more, will be a higher level of patient/consumer engagement in a lot of what we do, both therapeutically and diagnostically. And I think that's already begun by virtue, you know, as previously stated, of the internet in one hand, and in many geographies of them paying for it in the other. And I think that creates a whole lot of fantastic opportunities, you know, for everyone.
I know both Ken and Les want to jump in, and then we'll take the next question. So Ken?
Yes, so briefly, there's two sides. One is the patient or the consumer should have the opportunity, informed consumer, to purchase goods, including diagnostics. It's not always the doctor knows best. But the other side is the downstream costs of such a decision, which in Canada falls on the public side. And we know a great deal about the cost of these. It far exceeds the cost of the diagnostic. And quite often leads to anxiety and rather than to a diagnosis and a pathway to therapy. So it's a balancing act, and there needs to be a great deal of care in providing opportunities to consumers.
Les, you want to know? You don't think Chris wants to jump in there?
I guess I would like to echo the kind of theme is that genetics professionals, we tend to be a bit paternalistic and try to keep all of this under our control. But I think the reality is that patients are ordering these things already in Ontario and around the world. And my concern, and for most genetics professionals, is that it is trying to minimize the harm that are caused to patients based on the information they're getting or the lack of good information they're getting, and the decisions that they're going to make as a result of what they get back. And I do know that in Ontario, and the downstream costs as well, it's already become quite a concern for centers providing care here in the public system, and actually many of them refuse to follow up with the patients or charge them the private cost of that session because the test was ordered privately and it wasn't publicly endorsed. So they feel that if you're willing to do this, you're also willing and mandated to pay privately for the care that you get as a result of it, even though they're Ontario patients with Ontario health cards. So, and it's handled differently in every center. There's not really a consensus on how that's dealt with. So.
Okay. Thank you, that's interesting. Yes?
Hi, my name is Peter Asmi. I'm with Sim1, Director of Partnerships, and what we're seeing on the personalized medicine side, it's not only the theranostic story, but there's also the personalized patient health information story. So this has nothing to do with whether or not you have a diagnostic that goes with your therapeutic profile, but it could also be things like just what sorts of drugs you're on currently, you know, your age profile, your medical history. And then what we're seeing is that there's an interest in having companion apps that really helps patients manage their, you know, their diets and how they interact with their health professionals and how they interact with the health system in general. Is that something that you're seeing as a, you know, as a back end to the technology that you need to develop and integrate into the theranostic story?
So I try to make that point. I agree with you that it's much broader than a biomarker story. And interestingly, I was very struck. I just came back last week from Australia, which you know, has also got a dominant public payer and then some private payers in the market. And there, certainly on the private side and a little bit on the public side, you're starting to see the provision of a variety of tools, including personal physiological monitors, as well as the recommendation of certain apps to help patients manage their personal health information. So it seems to be a trend to take a broader definition along the lines that you're alluding to.
Oh, go ahead.
John Buckingham from Buckingham Alliance Partners. Thank you for the talk today. This has really touched on a number of things, and almost all of you have addressed the issue of, and if you call it precision medicine, this is better decision making, but it's not perfect. And so I'd be curious about some of the panel members' thoughts of having looked at segments of patients where some have a particular marker and test positive, and the majority in that segment respond. That's useful. But what about those who don't have the marker, but the clinical data have also shown that they do respond, albeit at a much lower rate? What kind of challenges face the healthcare system when that patient says, I would like the therapy, but I don't have the right marker that would lead you to say, I'm going to be a responder? The chances are lower. How do you deal with that? Did I ask the question clearly?
Sure. I think the way that it's handled primarily now in the clinical setting is basically, as you said, all this technology, it's not perfect and nothing is 100%. And sometimes if a patient tests positive for a marker, sometimes it speaks to a predisposition. It doesn't necessarily mean that the patient necessarily will develop, the particular phenotype or the symptoms associated with that marker. So the education of the clinicians involved always has to go back to, if it doesn't make sense from this diagnostics, default back to the clinical presentation of the patient and use your own clinical judgment on what you think the patient would benefit most from. And I think that's the approach that myself and the majority of the colleagues that I have worked with have taken over the years.
Which in some ways is empiric therapy as is practiced now. Yeah.
Les?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And the answer lies in the kinds of clinical trials that are done in the investigative phase of the drug development. And it has to include those people who don't possess the targeted genetic change. A really good example of that is in melanoma. So there's a change in the BRAF gene that predicts for a target to the BRAF gene. And the response rates are running at about 50 to 60%, which is something really incredible, because standard chemotherapy for melanoma, the response rates are running at 10%. And the legitimate question's been asked that even if you don't have that marker for BRAF, can you do better than 10% if you have the drug that's targeting BRAF, even if you don't have the BRAF? And your question is highly relevant to the kinds of clinical trials that need to take place with these drugs in the pre-market space. And that's the kind of question that needs to be answered. And the way you construct the clinical trial has to include people who don't possess the marker. And not enough of that stuff's going on at the moment. And it's the only way you can answer your question. And if we don't have those data right now, it's very tough. I don't know how you make those decisions, because we don't have the data. You just make the drug available. There's no answer to your question, because the research hasn't been done right.
Ken, did you want to add too?
This is a very important question, and to deny therapy on the basis of absence of evidence is not on. So the question is, what can be offered? And if that's all that can be offered, then perhaps there should be an individual trial, and the response should be measured. And this is, and we should be developing, obviously sounding my own horn here, but we should be developing further ways to, with some precision, for individuals to be able to measure response, not just in terms of acute response, what's happening today or tomorrow, but what's happening in terms of the disease process itself. What response is there that can modify the disease? So those are the kinds of things we should be looking for.
Yes, Les.
Just add one additional point, and that is that the opportunities for precision diagnostics and treatment modalities are going to be few. So what I worry about is that, that the whole research effort is going to move in this direction, a worst case scenario, because most drugs have been discovered by serendipity. And most drugs work in ways which we don't really understand properly, but they've had a huge impact on survival, on quality of life, etc. There's been a terrific amount of stuff that's been done in that regard. So there's got to be a balance here in terms of the research agenda as well. If we all go hunting down the specific kind of targets for developing new drugs, I worry we're going to miss opportunities for a much broader population of people suffering from chronic diseases, let's say. And that's a concern. And I don't know, I think that's also a question of balance.
Thank you. Actually, to add to that, Chris, I was curious before we'd had a little chat about, you were saying that some of the diagnostics you've used are for older drugs.
Yes.
And I had said, well, is pharma really interested in that? Because isn't that going to ultimately reduce their market? And you were saying, not really. So can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think some of it goes to this question, but it also goes to, if you're going to now do diagnostics for old drugs, are you going to get back into the situation where you're going to take things away from people who need them?
So as with many conditions, when patients are identified, they're usually at the more serious end of the spectrum. And we all know that through doing genetic diagnostics in families that there's a large variability even within families for many of these conditions. And so what we've been able to do is work with the pharma companies and actually broaden the spectrum of the disease through screening large numbers of patients for genetic markers related to particular groups of conditions, and actually have increased the number of patients that then become eligible or that they can further study to see whether they respond in similar ways to the patients at the more serious end of the spectrum. So we've increased their market size considerably for some of the drugs.
Okay. Interesting. One thing that came up a couple of times as we were going around is people mentioned training and education. Physicians, public, the industry coming into the government, all of those kind of things, government going back out. So do you want to comment to all of you a little bit about, is it really a barrier, training and education of different populations, or is it just the state we're in and it will move on? Just curious. I think, Chris, you mentioned that.
I think there's a couple of different aspects to it. For instance, in many provinces, the genetics healthcare providers or in the oncology groups are the approved healthcare providers to order some of these tests or use some of these diagnostic tools, when in fact there are a shortage of those trained, certified healthcare providers. And I'll give you an example. In Quebec, from Drummondville east all the way to the New Brunswick border, there is one genetics healthcare provider that can sign off and order the testing for a population of millions of people. So it's that bottleneck is a barrier for allowing people to access that market. And at the other end of things, here in downtown Toronto, there's a large concentration of health experts in various tertiary care centers that are able to and understand enough about genetics and genomics and personalized medicine to order these tests. But it's there are still, from our company, 60% of the testing diagnostics that are ordered are from non-genetics trained healthcare providers. But those healthcare providers in most medical training sites still only get 1 to 2 weeks of genetics training as part of their medical training. So they come out, they know what autosomal recessive is, they know some basics, but they don't know enough to interpret the complex diagnostic tests. So I think there's some work to be done on companies such as ours to make the reporting much clearer and much easier, but also to take a part in educating those as well, not just to put it back on the public system. But I do think there is some work to be done. And the world leader, I think, in my opinion, in this has actually been the UK. The UK did a systemic study of all healthcare providers, dentists, physiotherapists, you name it, and they said, in this role, what do these people need to know about personalized medicine and genetics? And they've integrated that into the education systems of all those people moving forward. So I think we have some catching up to do.
Right, that's interesting. Ken, you'd mentioned training, I think, or educating people about that.
Yes, one of the things which we have to do in the education, perhaps the most important thing, is the development amongst not only the professionals but the public as well of perspective. All of us are assaulted daily by the hype of various groups that have a particular interest in getting their message out and conveying the idea that if only you had this done to this test or that test, or you did this particular nutraceutical or whatever, your life would be happy, merry, and bright. The interesting truth of it is that we don't know enough to make those statements, and that most of us, most of the time, are very healthy, thank you. So we need to be able to develop that kind of perspective so that there is not a perpetual anxiety about wellness. We are well. We don't have to worry about it. And we do have to get on with life. So the education about the relative role of specific tests, specific therapies, specific interventions in health that apply to individuals is extremely important.
Right. Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? So we're almost at our time, and I'm conscious that we stand between you and your lunch. So I thought maybe we could just take maybe a minute for each panelist, or 30 seconds, if you have a final comment you want to make in this area. So maybe we'll start at Ken and work back to me. There you go, Ken.
Well, first of all, personalized medicine is not new. All medicine has been personalized, so the idea that it's more personalized or more precise should be the thought of the day. And the second point is that this is a very exciting time because there are substantive advances. There are new tests and new interventions that are being brought to market and brought to the healthcare scene. So we should welcome this and look forward to trying to make these things happen.
Les?
Yeah, and just to emphasize that targeted therapy has been around for 20 years. You wouldn't give a patient with breast cancer some of the drugs without knowing what the estrogen receptor status is or progesterone receptor status. That's been measured for 20 years. Herceptin's been out for at least 8 years, and that's HER2 new expression. It's based on that. We've been doing that predictive test, and it's just growing. I think it's terrific. I mean, you know, the fact that there are more of these drugs, they're not a lot more, but there are more of those drugs. And I would make an appeal. And my appeal would be normalize this. Do not accentuate it as something special. This is a natural evolution of treatment of disease. And normalize the companion test with the diagnostic and standardize and get consistency. How are we going to couple them? That's the only thing we need to do right now. The education part of it will be taken up on the same basis as evidence that we've used for everything else in our health system.
Yeah, I'd like to add to this and echo a comment that I think came from the floor, and that is to take a, whatever we want to call it, more precise, standard of care, whatever it is, take a broader view of it to include not just the biomarkers or diagnostic tests, but also the devices, the information, the other parameters that are integrated into taking care of a patient. And in addition, throw out the fact that at least south of the border, a substantial, close to 50% or a little more of patients coming to the oncologist for the first time have already accessed information on the internet. And so, I think that's a global phenomenon, and it's a train that has left the station. And so, however we as industry participants or providers or advisors or regulators or whatever think about it, there is going to be a different relationship with consumers and patients and information than what there's been in the past. And I don't know to what extent you all have patients here that go to sites like Patients Like Me or whatever, sort of social media networks, etc. But they're a reality of the future. How we interact with them, cater to them, try and work around them, etc., remains to be seen. But they're substantial, and they do influence the system.
Thank you. Chris?
Very quickly, because I know we're out of time, but I think when there are lots of opportunities out there in the market, both locally and internationally, and I think when keeping things in mind and having my genetic counselor hat on is how do we offer these products in a way, again, that are meaningful for patients, that they can use them to direct their own care. You know, they're using the internet, they want these tools to use in combination with the other information out there to direct and take charge of their own care and their family's care. And I think if you think of those ethical things and kind of the development and how you would present these to a patient, I think it would bring you a long way to kind of increasing the success and the uptake of in the market in the long run. So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I do want to thank all our panelists. I believe you had a last moment comment.
Sure. Again, thank you everyone for attending the panel. Thank you to all our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules. And thank you, Alison, for moderating the panel as well. I have a small token of appreciation for all of you, which I can give out at a later time. Again, this was a fantastic discussion. We learned so much about what personalized medicine is, what precision medicine is, and you know, what the critical obstacles are and what we can do to move ahead. So thank you, everyone. And I think we have lunch next, which is in the hall F right outside the main doors. So if everyone can move there, that we can enjoy the lunch this weekend. Thank you.